I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 153rd episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing betterment of your brain by any and all means at your disposal, the old, the new, and the truly elemental in this case. Let's start with a little bit of a riddle. Do you know the third element on the periodic table? Most of us know hydrogen's element number 1. Probably a good deal of us are science geeky enough to know that helium is element number 2. But by the time we get to number 3, there's a big drop-off. But the answer, drum roll please, is lithium. And lithium is the subject of today's podcast. It has long been known to be a psychoactive compound, but believe it or not, there's a lot we still don't know, and a lot of the potential hints of what lithium might be able to do for people are very promising. And we're going to be talking with an investigator, a scientist emeritus from the National Institute of Health, Dr. De-Maw Chuang, talking all about lithium in the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, following up somewhat on the traumatic brain injury episode that we had last week, in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick, we're going to be talking about a recent study with a potential neuroprotective therapy that can take place after brain injury has happened. But that'll be at the very end. First, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So every now and then we get a This Week in Neuroscience that actually is the current week in neuroscience, and this is one of those rare instances. This is based on a study that was just published in Frontiers in Neuroanatomy on Halloween of this year, so just last week. A study coming from Michigan State University where researchers are looking at the brains of big cats. In particular, they're trying to find out more about the evolution of carnivore brains, and of course the researchers are human, so they're interested in human brains as well. It's hard not to be. Humans are kind of the standout when it comes to brains, and one theory that's been put forward about why humans have such darn big brains, why it was advantageous for us to grow these brains, is that humans are very, very social animals. This is called the social brain hypothesis. And the basic idea behind it is that social relationships are confusing and cognitively demanding, and they can shift a lot, and keeping track of who's dating who and who hates who and where the alliances could be if you told Bob something nasty about Sarah and then Dale heard about it, all that kind of stuff requires a big brain. Or so the theory goes. And it would be a nice stroke of luck for backing up this theory if, as researchers looked at the brains of more or less social animals, they found some correlations in brain size, or at least in certain regions of the brain having size, that tracked along nicely with how social those particular animals were. So lead researcher Charlene Sakai, whose research was funded by a grant from the National Science Foundation, looked at 13 species of wild felines, of which 11 were solitary and 2, lions and cheetahs as it turns out, are particularly social. The researchers got their hands on 75 wild feline skulls, and they used CT scans to figure out what the actual flesh of the brain would have been inside the skull, and also, as best they could, what the size of the different brain regions would have been like, particularly the frontal cortex, which in humans at least is where a lot of this social processing happens. Sakai's findings, however, did not do much to help the social brain hypothesis. Says Sakai, our findings suggest that the factors that drive brain evolution in wild cats are likely to differ from selection pressures identified in primate brain evolution. For one thing, the overall brain size didn't differ all that much between the solitary and social species of wild cats. The winner of the largest overall frontal cortex went to the female lion. Female lions are highly social. They work together, they feed their young, they hunt together, they defend their territory. In contrast, male lions are kind of more solitary and standoffish, and the females of the species have the larger frontal cortex to show for it. So that actually lines up pretty well with the social brain hypothesis. However, then comes the leopard. The leopard is solitary, but it had a relatively large brain and it had a relatively large frontal cortex too, so that one flies in the face of the social brain hypothesis. And finally, the cheetah. Cheetahs had the smallest overall brains, and they also had the smallest frontal cortex of all the wild cats. However, they were also one of the 2 most highly social species in this sampling of the great cats. Sakai acknowledges that the cheetah might be a special case, and they might be so optimized for speed that keeping the brain small, the head aerodynamic, those things were the main driving factors of cheetah evolution, and would have put a premium on having a light skull and also a smaller brain which doesn't take as much energy to run, so as much of that cheetah physiology as possible can just be devoted to getting the cheetah moving fast. However, be that as it may, we still have a social cheetah, a small brain, and a feline chink in the armor for the social brain hypothesis.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews this week on iTunes. Listener Gregor929 from the USA says, "The brain is the vehicle for the mind," so says the eminent neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield. And this podcast delves into the neurochemistry which explains the interface. And Red Super Ted from the UK says, "I've been listening to this podcast for about 6 months, working through the older episodes as well as the new ones. I'm always impressed by each show and all the fascinating topics covered here." Well, thank you very much to both of you and to those of you who have left nice reviews that I haven't gotten to yet. I'm keeping a backlog. I'm keeping them around for a rainy day. So even if I haven't read your review yet, do not think that it has gone unnoticed. I'm getting ready in just a couple of weeks here to head to Helsinki, Finland for the 2016 Biohacker Summit. If anybody happens to be up in the region of Northern Europe or within striking distance of an international airport and wants to fly out, that will be the place to find me in about 2 weeks. November 17th, I think, is the kickoff date for the Biohacker Summit. I'll put up a link for the webpage on this episode. That'll be smartdrugsmarts.com/153. That'll have all the details there about the Biohacker Summit, including a 10% discount code for Smart Drug Smarts listeners. And if you do wind up coming out, definitely feel free to drop me an email or just find me there and introduce yourself, say hi. We can talk about brains, we can talk about biohacking, we can talk about how ungodly cold I'm prepared for it to be. But I'm sure cold thermogenesis, which we've never done an episode on now, but is probably a term that will not be unfamiliar to most of you. That is bound to be a big topic of conversation for that weekend. So come chill in Finland if you have a mind to. If you're following Smart Drug Smarts on any of the social media stuff, or for that matter, Axon Labs, then you might have caught our little flash sale that we did last week. There's something like a 12-hour sale that we had on Axon Labs products Nexus and Mitogen, our cognitive and mitochondrial stacks, where some sort of amazing deal took place. It was there and then it was suddenly gone, and only those people who are probably paying a little too much close attention to their social media to begin with were able to take advantage of that. Maybe we're encouraging bad behavior there. Maybe we should have a sale where you need to diligently plan ahead and you know for months in advance it's coming, and the people that use their calendars and schedule things, they draw the benefit. But that's not the way we did it last time. We might rethink that strategy, but either way, if you're curious about the Axon Labs products, Nexus or Mitogen, you can find them both anytime, night or day at axonlabs.io. Not have to watch your social media like a fiend, but of course, if you do feel like following us on social media, we will be duly honored, but no pressure, not a requirement. Flash sale or not, Axon Labs is there, rain or shine, at axonlabs.io. Or if you're on the Smart Drug Smarts website, you can just click over by clicking the shop link at smartdrugsmarts.com. That's all the news and tidbits, so we're about to go into the main interview. Get yourself prepped for lithium. You can get really excited. You can even get manic, because it turns out that lithium is still one of the primary treatments that doctors have for the prevention of mania.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So we don't talk much about nuclear physics on this podcast, nor should we. It's not about that. But just so you know, the transmutation of lithium atoms into helium way back in 1932 was the first fully man-made nuclear reaction. So impress your friends, amaze your enemies with that piece of lithium trivia. But we're going to be talking about the effects of lithium on human beings, human brains in particular. And it turns out that there are a ton of effects. Some good, some bad. There's a very narrow therapeutic range where it's just enough and not too much. Lithium is probably best known therapeutically for its treatment of bipolar disorder, but it's got a long history and also kind of a promising future as far as things that we don't know about it yet, but we have reason to suspect that it might be capable of therapeutically. And we're going to be talking with an expert on lithium, Dr. De-Maw Chuang of the National Institute of Mental Health. He's a scientist emeritus there, has studied lithium extensively over the course of a long scientific career. He has been chief of the molecular neurobiology section of the National Institute of Mental Health since 1999. And in 2012, he was honored as a distinguished alumnus of the National Taiwan University. As you will hear, Dr. Chuang does have a bit of a strong accent, so prepare yourself to hear more than a few L's that might wind up sounding like R's. Things like crinical instead of clinical. It's actually pretty easy once you get the hang of it, but do not let a little bit of accent parsing throw you off. This is a really interesting interview, and lithium is a fantastically interesting compound. So let's jump in now with Dr. De-Maw Chuang.
Lithium is very fascinating and powerful medicine. It has a long history of using lithium for medical conditions. It was discovered about 200 years ago, but has been used in medicine, I would say, for about 130 years. A doctor named Alexander Haig used lithium for the treatment of gout because it can inhibit the secretion of uric acid. And at the same time, he also used it for the treatment of depression. And this was 1888. 1888. And in 1894, another doctor, Carl Ram, explored the possibility of using lithium for the treatment of affective disorders. And a breakthrough finding was made in 1949. An Australian psychiatrist named John Keck found that lithium has anti-mania effect.
An anti-mania effect, basically helping somebody to calm down if they're having a manic episode?
Exactly. And this was found in the preclinical setting as well as in the clinical setting. And in 1953, a Danish doctor named Mania used a systematic clinical trial to prove that lithium indeed has anti-mania effect. So this was done in Europe. And in 1970, an American psychiatrist named Samuel Grosjean and his colleagues introduced lithium to the United States. And in 1974, FDA approved the use of lithium for the treatment of bipolar disorders. So this is actually 21 years after Dr. Shaw did the beautiful clinical trial in Europe. So we are pretty much behind. And I'd like to add something interesting, that the great artist Vincent van Gogh died by committing suicide, by shooting himself in 1989. At that time, lithium was already available in Europe for the treatment of depression. His doctor prescribed something else, a herb medicine, then foxglove, to treat Van Gogh's depression problem. So if Van Gogh had used lithium, he might not have committed suicide, and he might have created a lot of more great artist work.
What do we actually know so far about the mechanism of action of what lithium is doing inside the human brain that gives it its psychoactive properties?
So far, FDA approved lithium for the treatment of bipolar disorders, and because it's anti-mania effect. And I would have to say that the mechanisms underlying the therapeutic effect of lithium for the treatment of bipolar disorder is still unclear. There are several potential targets that could be involved in the therapeutic effect. One likely target is a protein, an enzyme called GSK3, glycogen synthase kinase 3. This is a potential target, but there is no absolutely proof that this is the target. And the other actions of lithium, which has been described in the last few years, which suggests that lithium may have other use in addition to treatment of bipolar disorders.
And what are some of the other areas where there might be preclinical or animal study evidence hinting that lithium might have some potential therapeutic uses that we're not taking advantage of yet?
Okay, actually, my group at the National Institute of Mental Health had contributed to the finding that lithium has a neuroprotective effect. And this effect was made in approximately the beginning of this century. For example, lithium can protect against insult to the nerve cell. This was a pretty simple experiment showing that if we expose a neuron to an excitotoxin called glutamate, the neuron die. Mm-hmm. And if you pre-treat it with lithium, then the neuron survive. So this was the first finding. And from this, actually, a series of findings was made by my former laboratory, as well as by many laboratories in the whole world, in animal model of brain disorders, such as stroke, traumatic brain injury, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, spinal cord injury. All these animals model of brain disorder show benefit when they were given lithium.
Yeah, I've got a general question about the term neuroprotective. Is that like a blanket term where if something is neuroprotective against, say, the toxicity of glutamate, that same compound would also offer neuroprotection against a physical whack in the head? Or can these facets of neuroprotection be more discrete?
Yeah, lithium's neuroprotective effect against brain disorder is pretty diverse. It can protect against chemical-induced brain injuries like glutamate, like oxidative stress, and so on. And it can also protect against physical injury, like a traumatic brain injury. So the mechanism, make it pretty simple, is that lithium can inhibit this enzyme, GSK3, which I mentioned earlier. And by inhibiting this enzyme, which happens to be a kinase, it can affect the phosphorylation state of a spectrum of proteins, many proteins. And these proteins happen to be important for the transcription process of protein. So as a result, many transcription factors are activated or induced. And this can result in the expression of many important proteins in the brain. Give to some example, BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factors, can be induced, and this can trigger neurogenesis, which means the making of new neuron, which is very important because our brain cells die every day. We need to have neurogenesis to replace the loss of neuron. Mm-hmm. Okay, so lithium can do that. And many other proteins like VEGF, which is a particular, and serial growth factors, FGF21, which is a new finding in our laboratory, fibroblast growth 21, and a very important neuroprotective protein called BCL2 can also be robustly induced. And finally, another protein called HISHAP protein 70, and this is important to combat neuroinflammation. After injury, or even in the psychiatric disease state, there's an increase in the brain inflammation, and lithium has the ability to suppress neuroinflammation, and this could also be pretty important for the benefit of lithium in even bipolar state or foreign brain injuries.
What sort of dosage are we talking about to get some of these neuroprotective effects?
For the treatment of bipolar disorder, the dose has been pretty much figured out. That is, we need to take lithium to maintain the blood level in certain range because lithium can be toxic when it is overdosed. Lithium has a rather narrow therapeutic windows. So we need to keep the blood level or serum levels between 0.4 to 1.2 millimolar. So the lithium taker will have to have their blood checked for the serum levels from time to time to make sure that they don't get lithium toxicity. So to maintain this level, typically for the treatment of bipolar disorder, for the acute treatment, you use about 1,800 milligram per day. If it's a slow release, you can use 900 milligram per day in the morning and the nighttime. And if it is for the regular release formulation, you can use 600 milligram 3 times a day. And for the long-term treatment, not the acute treatment, you use less. You use 900 to 1,200 milligram per day. And again, you can manipulate the dose for the purpose of slow release or regular release. And we don't have a lot of clinical information of lithium for the treatment of diseases other than bipolar disorders. Most of the evidence are based on preclinical study from many laboratories, including ours. Also, there is some nice clinical trials showing that lithium may be beneficial in Alzheimer's disease patients. And this, I hope, can be proven to be true, and because this will be extremely exciting and important. So for the treatment of other disease, we actually don't know whether we need to use the same amount of lithium. I'm hoping that less amount of lithium can be used, which has been supported by some preclinical and even some clinical observations. And I hope this is true so that we can minimize the lithium toxicity for the treatment of other diseases.
From my understanding, there are some areas where lithium is actually present in the water supply, in at least trace amounts, but I'm wondering if there's been any population level studies in these areas, seeing how populations that might be getting a constant low dose might be affected.
Yes, I'm glad that you raised this interesting question. I think the best example is in France. Lithium is present in kind of trace amount in the drinking water. And it's well known that French people have less cardiovascular disease. Whether this is due to the presence of lithium in their drinking water or not, we don't know. But it's an interesting possibility. And even in the United States and in Japan, there was some correlation study to show that in area where there is more lithium contamination in the drinking water, then the people there seem to have a better quality of life. Again, this is just a coincidence association. There's no strong scientific proof. But based on this association study, there could be some benefit of lithium for the normal people as well.
So if somebody has bipolar disorder and they're taking lithium therapeutically, what does that actually feel like as far as their day-to-day perceptions? And I guess perceptually, how would that differ from somebody with a more run-of-the-mill average brain that might take lithium?
I am a PhD, I'm not a clinician, but my understanding is this. The symptoms of bipolar disorders include hyperactivity, talking very fast, and has a racing thought. In other words, the people can think about many things at the same time, and agitation, can get angry easily, and also they don't need to sleep a lot, and also their brain are smaller. And all these issues can be addressed by lithium treatment. Lithium can suppress all these problems. That's my understanding. So lithium is particularly effective in controlling mania. And the bipolar disorder is characterized by repeated episodes of mania depression. Lithium is not a great antidepressant. It has some effect, but it takes a long time to inhibit depression, usually weeks. But the anti-mania effect can occur very quickly. In fact, lithium still is one of the mainstay treatment for the bipolar illness. And the half-life is approximately 24 hours. But this can vary from people to people.
Right.
So in terms of taking lithium, you need to talk to your doctor. And the doctor will determine your dosage. The bottom line is that you want to maintain the lithium in the right level.
Are there particular contraindications, certain people that a doctor might never prescribe lithium to, or other people that are particularly good candidates candidates?
Yes, lithium doesn't work for everybody. In the bipolar population, only about 50% of the bipolar patients respond to lithium treatment. Why is that? There's a big issue, and that is something that many laboratories, including my collaborator, studying. We try to identify certain protein. If that is expressed, then we can say that this person is a lithium responder. We can give lithium to this person. And yes, you are right. There are certain people who should not take lithium. First of all, some people can be allergic to lithium. And these symptoms include difficulty in breathing. You have very bad rash on your skin, and you have swelling in your face, particularly in the lip, tongue, and throat. So these people should never take lithium. And also, if you have low sodium problem, you shouldn't take lithium either. Lithium can affect the entry of sodium into the nerve cell. So it can potentially lower your sodium levels. And another condition is that if you have a kidney problem and thyroid problems, you may not want to take lithium, because one of the lithium side effects is to affect your function in the kidney and thyroid. Another issue is whether a pregnant woman or woman who plan to be pregnant should take lithium or not. That also need to be consulted with your doctor. And finally, lithium is not approved for the treatment of children under 12 years old. So although in Europe, lithium is also given to some children, but in the United States, I think we have pretty strict control. The bottom line, again, is to talk to your doctors.
I always find it funny how different countries have different legal standards for the drugs that they make prescription versus over-the-counter. And you almost couldn't guess. Sometimes you can buy something over-the-counter in the U.S. that's prescription in Europe, and then you see exactly the opposite on something which seems kind of similarly dangerous.
That's true. Usually, United States has a very strict regulation by the FDA. So usually, we are behind in using a new drug. And because of the tight regulation, we are also slower in developing new drug. They estimated that for developing a new drug in Europe is about 6 to 7 years faster than that in the United States.
Let's say that somebody has been taking lithium therapeutically for enough time that they've become an established part of their system, and then they were to stop taking it. Are there any long-term effects that would remain after the lithium has been cleared from the system, or is it primarily just an acute response?
Yes, lithium response, again, depends pretty much on individuals. Some people can take lithium in their whole life because lithium is the best for them for bipolar depressive illness. However, some people, particularly the elderly, cannot tolerate lithium very well. So they have to stop taking lithium, and this has been the reason that lithium is not terribly popular because of its side effect and poor tolerability. If you have to stop it, that is fine. But usually, lithium's effect can continue for a while even after you stop taking lithium, because some of the effect, for example, if lithium affects the expression of protein, those proteins will be around even after you stop taking lithium. So don't expect the lithium's effect to disappear immediately after stop taking lithium.
I'm wondering about something that you said earlier about glutamate excitotoxicity and how useful lithium is for the treatment of mania. I'm just wondering because glutamate is sort of an excitatory neurotransmitter, and sort of the pop psychology definition of mania is just being too excited, too wound up. Could those two be related? The idea that lithium's effective as an anti-mania drug, and it also is therapeutically effective against glutamate excitotoxicity. I mean, is that a reasonable suspicion? Am I oversimplifying things?
I think there is certain linkage. Glutamate actually is a transmitter by itself in low amount. Is very critical for our brain function, including memories and many other neurophysiological functions. But in excessive amount, it's toxic. And many types of diseases are related to excitotoxicity, mostly neurodegenerative diseases, such as a stroke. After stroke, there is a glutamate overflow that kills the neuron very quickly. Traumatic brain injury is the same thing. As far as the mental illness, like bipolar disorder, we have much less information. But we do know that the blood level or the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid level of glutamate, is higher in the individuals with bipolar disorders. And whether this contributes to the pathogenesis or pathophysiology of bipolar disorder or your depression, we still don't know at this time.
There's a piece of medical terminology I don't think we've ever talked about on this show, but it's something called the pharmaceutical index. I know you know what this is, but just to give people a little bit of background, the pharmaceutical index is a number, it's a ratio between the amount of a given substance that would kill 50% of the people. It's called the LD50, the lethal dose for 50% of the people that would be taking it, versus a therapeutically effective dose. So again, a ratio between how much would kill you versus how much would do whatever it's supposed to do. So you want that to be a big number. Ideally, you would have a massive span of distance between those two amounts. Something with a low pharmaceutical index, you got to be really careful with. Something with a high pharmaceutical index, you don't worry about as much because you're a long way from ever taking an amount that could actually hurt you. Now, you've mentioned a couple times that there's a pretty narrow range for a safe amount of blood serum level of lithium for the treatment of bipolar disorder. I'm wondering, do you know what that number is, what the pharmaceutical index is in the context of lithium used therapeutically for bipolar disorder?
I don't have the number at hand. Lithium can have overdose effect, but I think very, very seldomly resulting in the death of individuals. It does have a narrow therapeutic window. As I say, the serum level has to be about 0.4 to 1.5 millimolar. And I think to cure a person by using lithium, you need to use a lot of it. But you can have overdose effect, which will give you a warning that this person should not take lithium anymore. For example, if you start to have hand tremor, if you start to have nausea and vomiting, then it is time to stop. Unless you want to commit suicide, I think very few people will continue to take lithium when they experience this lithium toxicity or overdose toxicity. And again, yes, these side effects are not easy to tolerate. That make lithium not a popular drug. It's very powerful. In some conditions, you just have no choice because lithium can provide the benefit you need, even though it's hard to take.
Does lithium have either a tolerance that builds up over time or a potential for addiction or physical dependence?
I'm not aware of that. Some people can have allergy to it. And as I say, some people can take lithium for a long time. And in fact, some benefit is more obvious for an individual who has taken lithium for a long time. For example, there is a very large epidemiological study. Over 2,000 people participate in the study, which shows that bipolar patients who have taken lithium for over 2 years, they tend to live much longer. And they have much less cardiovascular attack, in addition to much incidence of committing suicide. So it doesn't seem to be a problem for an individual to take lithium for a long time as long as they can tolerate it.
That's really interesting that there's actually an effect on overall longevity.
Yes, that is true. And it also decreases incidence of getting Alzheimer's disease in bipolar patients taking lithium compared with those who took other medicines.
Is the National Institute of Mental Health doing anything still currently with a study of lithium? And what studies would you most like to see personally in the future?
Actually, I have retired from the NIMH, and now I'm a scientist emeritus. But I have a collaboration with people in other countries. For example, in Taiwan, we have a plan to use lithium for the treatment of traumatic brain injury, particularly motorcycle victim resulting in traumatic brain injury. So I would like to see that more clinical trials can be done using lithium to treat many types of brain disorders. TBI is one, stroke is another one. Alzheimer's disease also need to be substantiated because there were also studies showing that lithium doesn't have benefit in Alzheimer's disease. Also, there is a very nice studies published in 2011 by Florenza's group that 12 months treatment with low dose of lithium can have benefit in learning and memory. So I would like to see these type of studies can be substantiated, and I'd like to see that low amount of lithium can be used to conquer these brain disorders.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very, very much to Dr. De-Maw Chuang for taking the time to talk us through lithium, some of its history, some of the things that we know it can do, and many of the things that we suspect it might be able to do, but the studies aren't really there yet. One of the main problems, I guess, with trying to get further studies on what might be some of lithium's untapped potentials is that there's not a whole lot of financial incentive for any of the big pharmaceutical companies to do these tests on lithium because it's been around for so long that it's been off patent for decades. Any number of drug manufacturers could make and sell lithium. It's available as a generic. And so spending tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to push through big new human clinical trials, unfortunately, the financial incentive just isn't really there for that. So some of these points of data, lithium lowering mortality risk and things like that, they're tantalizing, but it's fair to say we might not actually get an answer on that stuff anytime soon, which is a little bit frustrating when science has good mysteries that we probably could crack, but there's just not the financial oomph to make it happen, even though there might be something good just over the horizon. But one thing that we definitely have just over the horizon is the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So last week we talked about traumatic brain injury, which is a topic I'm sure we will return to again. Although it seems like all brain injuries would be traumatic, traumatic actually has a specific meaning. It's kind of the bumps and sudden impacts style of injury versus something like not getting enough oxygen for a long time, which, although it might be emotionally traumatic, is not quite the kind of trauma they're talking about when it comes to TBI. One thing that wasn't mentioned in that episode but was passed on to me by a listener shortly after we published, hat tip by the way to brain hacker Rob who sent me this article, is that the hormone progesterone, which is pretty much widely known as a sex hormone but does other things within the body as well, might have some conspicuously good effects as far as the promoting of brain recovery after TBI. There have been quite a few studies. As you might imagine, this is on rats, not on people. Rats are unfortunately the fall guys when it comes to all these experiments intentionally giving brain injuries and then seeing how they respond under various treatments. And both the winners and the losers in the treatment domain, they all still generally get killed, sacrificed as it's called, so the brains can be examined and the researchers can see what worked and what didn't. So a little background on the difficulties of pharmaceutical therapies of brain injury. There have been very few new approaches to treating brain injury for decades and decades. Glucocorticoids, which are kind of one of the starring chemicals if you've read the book Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, they were for a long time a mainstay of traumatic brain injury treatment, but they're now known to be harmful. There was a major study called the CRASH trial. That was an acronym for corticosteroids after significant head injury. That had more than 10,000 subjects in 40 different countries, but the study was halted because the treatment group was found to have a significantly higher mortality rate than the control group. So they pulled out the stops on that one. But a while back, it was sort of serendipitously noticed by researchers that there were sex differences between male and female rats in how they responded to, and in particular, how they recovered from TBI. Long story short, the female rats seemed to have a better time with it. The researchers noticed this anomaly and they thought, hey, maybe there's a hormonal basis to this. So they divided up 3 groups of mature rats. There were males, there were females that were in proestrus, and then there was what they called pseudopregnant females. Pseudopregnancy was induced by mild mechanical stimulation of the cervix, and these pseudopregnant females had high circulating levels of progesterone and comparatively low levels of estrogen. So they had these 3 groups, and then animals in each of the 3 groups got a calibrated contusion to the medial frontal cortex of the brain, and it turned out that the female rats in proestrus had significantly less brain edema than male rats. And edema is not something you want happening in your brain. It's not really something you want happening in any tissue, but in the brain it can be particularly damaging because you got this tight skull that the brain is pretty tightly packed inside, and adding a whole lot of swelling and pressure with nowhere to go in that system is not good. And then finally, the pseudopregnant females, compared to the other 2 groups, they developed almost zero post-injury cerebral edema. So the scientists thought maybe they were onto something here. The rat groups in that trial all had naturally occurring progesterone. It wasn't something that was coming in from the outside, but they ran other tests and they found that exogenous progesterone, including that injected into male mice, could still have significantly beneficial effects for the recovery from TBI. So the increased pressure inside the skull is what makes cerebral edema really dangerous, and the sooner that edema is controlled, the better. Now, when rat brains were injured, they saw that the cerebral edema would start within 2 hours after the injury. Naturally, it would peak about 24 hours later, and it had decreased by 7 days. But researchers found that by administering progesterone 1 hour after the injury took place, the rat brains would recover by day 3 to the point that they normally wouldn't recover to until day 7. Knowing that they were onto something now, they tried various methods, how much progesterone, when exactly to apply it post-injury. They found that for rats at least, it was best to administer the treatment 2 hours after the injury, although really any time within the first 24-hour window was helpful. More progesterone was better. It did seem to table off and eventually become negative after a point. I'm not going to go into the dosages because these are rat dosages, not terribly applicable to anybody listening. But long story short, very promising findings as far as progesterone and recovery from TBI. The question, of course, is does this work for humans as well? There was one clinical trial done in 2007 looking at 100 male and female patients with a variety of closed-head blunt traumas with moderate to severe damage. Closed-head blunt trauma is about what it sounds like. It means the head did not actually crack open, but they got hit with something that was not sharp, but did some serious damage. The patients in this trial received state-of-the-art treatment, plus either a placebo or progesterone. The progesterone group received a continuous intravenous drip for 3 days post-injury, and looking at both groups 30 days later, there was a significant difference in the level of mortality, 33.6% in the placebo group and only 13.4% in the progesterone group, so again, a pretty impactful finding. However, this is still considered a fairly small trial and not conclusive. Unlike rats, where you can injure a brain according to an exact plan, make sure that all the brain injuries happen the same, just like clockwork, you obviously can't do that with humans. So a 100-person trial with sort of a random grab bag of head injuries, there's still a lot of variance in that, the type of injuries and the various things going on. You don't necessarily want to take that data to the bank, but progesterone, worth looking at.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so that is it for episode number 153. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you want to see links to anything that we talked about here, or want to pass this episode to a friend and want the URL for that, you can find it online at smartdrugsmarts.com/153. If you missed last week's episode, our Halloween episode, it wasn't terribly Halloweeny, but we did talk about traumatic brain injury in episode number 152. And next week, I think we're going to be talking specifically about dietary fats and the brain. Unless you've been living under a nutritional rock the last couple of years, you're aware of sort of the big backlash against sugars, including to a large extent even what we think of as the good sugars. But of course, you got to eat something, and those long demonized animal fats now have some very outspoken and frequently heavily data-backed advocates. We'll be talking with one of those in next week's episode. And the following week, number 155, I think we'll be diving back into the psychedelics. Won't swear to that one yet, but more likely than not, a couple of things are going to have happen in the meantime. But most importantly, see you back here next week, same time, same podcast, and with that same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.